FBI to categorize trans people as nihilistic violent extremists, threat group report says. Yeah, I've been seeing numerous headlines over the last couple of weeks, from insider information about how there are talks with this administration wanting to try and take guns away from trans people in whatever way that they manage to flesh that out in. And what I can't help but think of is the idea, the whole concept of trying to take away guns from a whole section of the population seems completely inconceivable within the context of gun rights groups, right? You would think if gun rights groups were being consistent, they would be over the moon on this. They would be sounding the alarm to an extent that you couldn't possibly imagine, because this is literally what so many of them fearmonger on the Democrats about, right? So many of these gun groups literally cut their teeth fearmongering that the Democrats want to take your guns, which is a bunch of nonsense. There is no elected Democrat representative, as far as I understand, anywhere that is in favor of abolishing the Second Amendment and taking away everybody's guns. Okay, some of them, they're in favor of varying levels of restriction and whatnot. You would think that these gun rights groups would be out there rioting in the streets, right? The idea that they want to just take away guns from an American, right? This is literally what they've been fear-mongering about for decades and decades, okay? But I think I saw a statement from the NRA and some of these groups saying that they don't support this, but I have a feeling that they are going to make basically no stir about this. There's going to be no hubbub, that they're going to, for the most part, keep their lips sealed, and I speculate it's because there is such a huge overlap between the types of people that engage in these pro-gun groups and the amount of people that are totally fine, that have bought hook, line, and sinker into this anti-trans stuff and are totally fine with restricting their access to guns. I think that overlap, the Venn diagram there, the middle part, might be kind of big. And so I wonder if that is why, if it's not really a principle thing, right? You think, because look, think about this. If they tried to do this for any other group, imagine if they tried to take the guns from straight white people or something, right? It would be World War III. They'd lose their minds. And so it seems almost hypocritical. But yeah, these gun groups should be out in the streets rioting. They should be losing their minds. That's all you should be hearing about from them. But I don't think that they actually care, because I don't think that they're super principled people. I think most of them only care about if you're taking the guns from them. They don't care if you're taking guns, for the most part. They don't care if you're taking guns from other people. They care if you're taking guns from them only. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is reportedly preparing to categorize transgender people as violent extremists, a categorization supported by organizations affiliated with Project 2025. According to a September 18th report by independent journalist Ken Klippenstein, two anonymous national security officials said that the Bureau is discussing treating trans subjects as a subset of its new threat category, nihilistic violent extremists, which was created earlier this year. The Bureau defines nihilistic violent extremists as criminal conduct in furtherance of political, social, or religious goals that derive primarily from a hatred of society at large and a desire to bring about its collapse by sowing indiscriminate chaos. Okay, so there's so much vagueness in this, right? Sowing indiscriminate chaos is extremely vague. I don't know how you could ever possibly prove or disprove that in court, because it doesn't really mean anything. But I also think it's hilariously ironic that the Republicans, of all people, are wanting to use the word nihilistic in this context, when I have argued that the Republican Party, more or less, has become the party of nihilism. They have become the party of a rejection of science, right? A rejection of climate science, a rejection of gender medical science with regards to treating transgender youth and stuff, right? A rejection of economic science and how tariffs affect policy and what is good economic policy and where the tax rate should be and minimum wage and stuff like that, right? I would argue on almost all fronts, the Republican Party has become the party of nihilism. So it's hilariously ironic that they are going around calling other people nihilistic. Officials said that such a classification would give the Trump administration political and media cover as they escalate their anti-trans campaign in the aftermath of right-wing pundit Charlie Kirk's death. They are cynically targeting trans people because the shooter's lover was trans, an unnamed senior intelligence official told Klippenstein. The administration has convinced itself that the Charlie Kirk murder exposes some dark conspiracy. Last week, the false claim that there were transgender engravings on the bullets that suspect Tyler Robinson allegedly used to shoot Kirk began circulating widely, boosted by anti-LGBTQ conservatives like Representative Nancy Mace and Steven Crowder. Utah Governor Spencer Cox later confirmed that there was no indication that the ammunition included transgender references, despite no evidence linking an alleged trans roommate to Robinson's motivation for shooting Kirk. Right-wingers are nevertheless attempting to use this detail to push an anti-trans agenda. In a petition launched on Thursday, the Heritage Foundation, the far-right think tank behind the derided and controversial Project 2025, and its spin-off group, the Oversight Project, asked the FBI to designate transgender ideology-inspired violent extremism as a domestic terrorism threat category. This goes without saying, but anytime, anywhere, especially when it comes from a Republican conservative in this government, but really anytime you see anybody ever say the word transgender ideology, they almost, like, my mind immediately goes to the fact that it almost is a bit of a dog whistle. I hate using that word because it sounds kind of cringy, but it's almost like a bit of a dog whistle in that, like, they're coming from because transgender ideology, that statement doesn't really make much sense, right? Because transgender people exist, medical science backs it up in almost every way, shape, and form, right? We know transgender care for youth people works. We know transgender care for adults works. We know it's safe. We have decades and decades of studies about this, right? We understand the difference. We have a deep academic understanding about the difference between gender and sex, of biological sex and gender. And so anytime you see somebody use the word transgender ideology, to me, it signals they are not coming from a place of science. They are coming from most likely, maybe not literally all the time. Some people could be using the word transgender ideology not within this context, but I find most of the time they have been tricked into some weird, like, thinking trans people are not real, or that the science isn't there, or that they're abusing minors, or that they're hiding the ball about something that they don't like about trans people, because the whole idea of a transgender ideology doesn't make sense, because it's just reality. There's no such thing as a transgender ideology. It's stupid. The group defines TIVE as the belief that violence is justified against people who oppose the trans community, as well as the belief that opposing trans rights itself constitutes a form of violence towards people who identify as trans or gender nonconforming, or possess an imminent threat to such persons' emotional, psychological, or physical safety, including through self-harm or suicide. So it's funny that the way that they word this, right? As well as the belief that opposing trans rights, quote, itself constitutes a form of violence towards people who identify as trans or gender nonconforming. I'm personally somewhat privy to that argument, right? I mean, I think the way that a lot of people use the word violence is maybe a bit too narrow, right? When you think of the word violence, typically you think of physical stuff, right? You think of somebody punching somebody, you think of somebody breaking a window or something like that. And yes, that is violence, but violence isn't only that, right? Violence is a bit more of a broad concept and can be applied a bit more broadly, right? And so I would argue that, like, what is let's say you have a government program that provides food to people, and then you cut that government program, and we know that cutting that government program will result in X number of people starving to death or whatever, right? Is that not a sort of a form of violence, right? In the sense that, like, the people in that system, ostensibly don't have all that much ability to change their circumstance, and that they are sort of like, they're a passenger in the seat. The government program keeping them alive is the car, and they're a passenger in that seat. And that the removal of this government program is to many of them a death sentence. Well, how is that all that much different? It almost seems like a meaningless distinction to some other examples you might use the word violence. Now, I wouldn't really hang my hat on this point too much, right? Because, like, we're really quibbling about, like, the semantic definition of the word violence. But I do think that, like, there is definitely a grain of truth in the argument that, like, opposing trans rights for basically no good reason, which can tangibly result in more people not getting the access to healthcare that they need and potentially killing themselves or having a much lower quality of life as a result, could potentially be argued as, like, a form of violence. So I think whoever wrote this, is writing it. Whoever wrote this writes it as like very dismissively, like, oh, if somebody believes that, it's crazy and they're a criminal. But like that doesn't seem that absurd to me, right? That seems like somewhat logical. It seems like a somewhat logical connection to make. As The Independent noted, if such a category is adopted by the FBI, it could be applied to rhetoric used by activists, writers, and allies speaking out against anti-trans policies and rhetoric. At least a dozen hoaxes have claimed trans people were responsible for mass shootings and other incidents since 2012. In reality, there is no evidence suggesting significant patterns of violence committed by trans people. In 2024, the Gun Violence Archive's executive director, Mark Bryant, said that out of 5,000 mass shootings tracked by the archive, the number of trans or LGBTQ plus suspects is, quote, in the single digit numbers, end quote. So yeah, obviously the pretext for which they're going to use all of this is the argument that like trans people are mentally ill, and that the DSM and medical agencies that don't consider it, or used to consider it a mental deficiency but don't anymore, are like woke and indoctrinated, and that like really these are all mentally ill people, and that is why you shouldn't be allowed to take their guns, right? That is probably the reasoning that they're going to go with. And I just worry that like we have so many unprincipled, unserious people in this country that they're just going to go with that. They're just going to be like, they aren't going to look up any of this. They aren't going to fact check any of these claims. They're just going to go, yeah, I think trans people are weird. Yeah, I could see the argument that they're mentally disabled. And if that's the case, then they shouldn't have access to guns, right? I could even see somewhat normie people running along with this, even though like it is completely detached from medical reality, from any sense of ethics or morals or anything, right? It's just insanely stupid. And also, where are the gun rights groups? Okay, where are the gun rights groups? They should be losing their minds. They should be on national TV every day screaming at the top of their lungs about this. How like, what's the saying? First they came for the communists and I did not care because I was not a communist. And then they came for the socialists and I did not care because they were socialists. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not care because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not care because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody else, nobody left to stick up for me. So I don't know. I care so much about consistency or whatever. And if I was one of the people who was kind of in this gun rights group mindset, all right, this is the exact kind of thing that would like flick on the light switch and make me lose my mind and make me black-pilled on all of this stuff, right? Not some nonsense about the Biden administration's FTC, firearm dude making some rule change about how you get to access ammo and it makes it slightly more expensive or whatever, right? That's not, who's really trying to take your guns here, right? Some of the Democrats wanting to have restrictions on like machine guns and things like that, or the Republicans that are literally trying to take the guns away from all trans people, right? It's hard to figure out.